and welcome everybody to the first of IIEP's Strategic Debates for 2022. We're very pleased, very happy to have you all with us. And we look forward very much to your inputs, your comments, as we learn from the exciting colleagues who have joined here today to launch and to present the findings from a new book published by IIEP in collaboration with a team at Penn called Learning, Marginalization, and Improving the Quality of Education in Low-Income Countries. And this debate, the debate arising from this book, is really part of a very important new flagship program at IIEP, from planning to implementation, which focuses on how can we move from the world of planning to do good things in education to actually ensuring that they are implemented. And so the topic for today is really focused on that implementation challenge. Now, IIEP has been involved in the LBOP, as it's called, initiative since the first conference in 2017. We co-organized and hosted the second LBOP conference in 2020, which of course took place online because of the global pandemic. That conference brought together 80 research, policy, and practice experts from around the globe. Papers were then developed, finalized, and collated into this publication being launched today. And Suzanne Grant-Lewis, our former director, was one of the editors of that new book. This second phase of LBOP placed increased emphasis on what is happening on the ground at the country level. And case studies on 4 countries were conducted: Mexico, India, Cote d'Ivoire, and Kenya, with inputs from locally based researchers and not-for-profit staff, as well as experts working within or in government. The case studies really aim to contextualize the challenge of what does it mean to enhance learning outcomes for children at the very bottom of the social and economic pyramid in these societies. What are the specific challenges faced at a country level? And also what kinds of initiatives, what kinds of programming can help to overcome some of the disadvantage of these children who live at the bottom of the pyramid. The last aspect of the book is really focused on this question of implementation. Although that wasn't really in the title, you can see in the book itself that this question of implementation is very central to the arguments made through each of the country case studies, and that becomes the focus for our strategic debate. Now, let me just say a few words about IIEP. IIEP has a unique mandate. It is a UNESCO institute with the responsibility for supporting ministries of education to better plan and to better manage their education systems. And increasingly, we see ourselves being asked to support governments, not only in planning, which has always been our core business, but also to strengthen their ability to manage and implement to achieve strong outcomes for children. And so again, the focus for today really is a help to IIEP as we move into this territory of improving management capacity to deliver results for children. This is going to be the first in a series of debates around the issue of moving from planning to implementation, from planning to delivery. And if you subscribe to IIEP's newsletter, and I think Camilla, one of our staff, will put the link in the chat, this would help you to be informed of coming events, and we really welcome your participation. So again, please, a warm welcome to today's panelists, and particularly to Professor Dan Wagner, who is going to be moderating the event and who played such a pivotal role in the Learning at the Bottom of the Pyramid program and project. Thank you, everybody, and on we go. Dan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen, and it's great to be with you and great to have our panelists with me and so many of you globally who are able to Zoom in with us today. I'm going to share my screen, and I have a few slides to present by way of introduction to our panel today. So as Karen said, this is we are on the topic of the theme that IIEP would like to focus on, one of their main themes, moving from policy to implementation, which is, as those of us who've been involved in learning at the bottom of the pyramid initiative see as a direct next set of steps around what will happen after this book that has just come out, and which I'm going to share with you in just a moment. Before that, I'd like to give us just a context for this conversation. Some of you will know this context very well. For some of you, maybe it's a little bit on the newer side. Almost everybody, I'm assuming, on this call will be aware of the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, and goal number 4 on quality of education. And it's linked to the issue of learning, the learning crisis, as some people call it. Of course, part of this has been around for a long time, but as you know, and now looking back over the last several decades, we know that we have made major improvements globally in access to primary and secondary education, especially even in low-income countries. But as bullet number 2 says, there still remain huge learning gaps between the top and the middle socioeconomic levels and those at the bottom of the pyramid, as Karen said a moment ago, and leading to an additional type of learning crisis within countries and a learning equity gap, as some people call it. And we know that since the founding of the UN and more recently the COVID-19 pandemic, many people have focused on or made broad statements about helping those most in need, and with the aim to push policy change and implementation for learning equity. And yet what we have found, and I think we'll hear about, and this is part of the debate today, where are we in achieving that kind of learning equity, especially within countries in different parts of the world? And that's what our speakers will be talking about today. I'm going to say a few more words about the LBOP initiative and then introduce our panelists. So this first book that came out of the 2017 conference on LBOP was published by IIEP-UNESCO. It's the book that Karen referred to. It's had a number of funders that you can see listed here: UNESCO, University of Pennsylvania, various foundations and agencies. And its main focus was to look at the kind of research we had on learning at the bottom of the pyramid. It was more of a scientific exploration. If you haven't gotten yourself a copy of this book, all you have to do, if you look at the last bullet here, is Google right now, IIEP LBOP, and download your free copy. It's right in front of you. So that book actually was, I think, well received. It has quite a number of interesting chapters and many authors and many comments. Some of you on this call probably provided comments in that book. Now, most recently, and only a few weeks ago, a second book came out, what we call the LBOP2 book. And you can just Google IIEP LBOP2 and get your copy of this book, which is co-edited by myself, Nathan Castillo, and Suzanne Grant-Lewis. This is Learning Marginalization and Improving the Quality of Education in Low-Income Countries. We are relaunching this book today, and I wanted to say a few words before we get into the debate, which will be focused on the case studies by our distinguished panelists. I'd like just to mention that at the front part of this book, there are a number of what we call thematic research chapters, and they cover issues like diversity, migration, metrics and assessments for learning, teaching, technology, and financing. And I thought I would just say, you might wonder, well, do we have to look at these topics again? We know all of these topics are not new to us. What's new? Well, we found in the chapter on teaching that increased information research suggests that teachers of the poorest children often have the least training. Again, something we kind of know, but we don't know well in every country. This is one area that we need in order to move from policy to implementation. In terms of technology, EdTech interventions are rarely focused on the poor. There are lots of wonderful ideas and silver bullets out there, but they rarely reach the poorest populations, often because they simply don't have access or resources to be connected either to the internet or to devices. And finally, again, in a study done by 2 World Bank scholars, that per capita expenditures in terms of financing and education are lowest in the poorest quintile of the population. Now, most of us around the world know this from our own situation, whatever country we're in. Poor kids get the bottom of the barrel in terms of financing school books, facilities, technology, trained teachers. What can we do about this? There's a chapter on that, a thematic chapter, a global review done by 2 people from the World Bank. So then today's strategic debate is organized around 3 of the case studies we have: Mexico, India, and Kenya. The focus that we have chosen for this is around 4 different topics, sets of questions to each of our panelists. The first is how to define LBOP at a local or national level. Broadly speaking, we sometimes do this and say, who are the countries that are low-income countries? Who are the countries who are high-income countries or OECD countries? But it's really within the countries that we have to understand what LBOP means. So this will be a focus. That's our first question. Second question is, what kind of research have they uncovered in each of their case studies, or maybe regionally as well, that support an understanding of LBOP? And what are the kind of gaps of information that continue? Third, what are the ways we can support LBOP implementation in terms of education? And what are some of the obstacles in each of those case studies? And finally, what kind of policy commitments, capacity building, and funding are needed as we move forward into what we are calling now LBOP 3, which is the implementation, policy to implementation phase? What is required? So our panelists are from Mexico, Silvia Schmelkes, sociologist and researcher at the Universidad Iberoamericana of Mexico. Second, from India, Rangachar Govinda, former vice chancellor of the National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration in New Delhi. And John Mugo from Kenya, executive director of Zizi Afrique Foundation in Kenya. Our discussion, is Karen Mundy, who will come on after the 3 panelists. And then we will have a Q&A in using the chat or chat box open to each of the participants. You'll put whatever you want in the chat box, but also put your questions in the chat box. And we have one of our IIEP associates, Camilla Petrakis, who will be keeping track of those questions and feeding them back to me, and I will feed them back to our panelists and back to all of you in the audience today. So thank you very much. I'm Dan Wagner, as you know, from the University of Pennsylvania. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and I'm going to turn it over to Silvia Schmelkes and encourage you again. I see the chat box has already started. Feel free to continue with that as we move along, and I'll kind of try to keep track of them myself and feed them back to the panelists. Silvia, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, to describe how we understand learning at the bottom of the pyramid, children and youth in Mexico today. In Mexico, we do have standardized test results, so that is the main indicator to identify those that are at the bottom of the learning pyramid. And before the pandemic, more than 50% of Mexican children and youth enrolled in school are at the bottom of the learning pyramid, or were before the pandemic. At the end of 6th, 9th, and 12th grades, their outcomes are below level 2, which is the threshold that defines being able to continue studying. And to this, we have to add around 8% of children between 12 and 14 that are not in school, and around 23% of youngsters between 15 and 17 that are not enrolled. And both of these numbers, those children that are learning below the threshold and those that are not in school, have increased with the pandemic. We have no data on learning loss, unfortunately, but the estimations are that especially among the poorest, they have lost almost the equivalent of the almost 2 years that schools were closed, because Mexico is one of the countries in the world where schools were closed the longest. We do expect high dropout rates, especially among older students who are able to work, because child labor has become very important during the pandemic. For example, a very recent study revealed that since 2019, 366,000 students in higher secondary have abandoned schools. And this represents around 7.3% of the total enrollment at this level, and it is probably underestimated. We know who these children are and who these children and youngsters are. They're mainly rural, indigenous, internal migrant workers, children living in marginal urban areas and in poverty. And this affects 44% of the Mexican population. In this data, we have no information about international migrants who have now become a very important number in Mexico. So that is also worrisome. I have had the opportunity of working with indigenous children, just to put an example, and it is sad to see how schooling is alien to them. Teaching is mainly in a language that is not their own. I have seen children in 6th grade able to read text in Spanish without understanding what they are reading, able to take dictation without understanding what they are writing, and they are going into secondary school, which is completely in Spanish and will not be able to survive. I have also worked with internal pendular migrants who come and go from their community of origin to the places where there is industrial agriculture. And I have witnessed the fact that the education system has not been able to develop a way of adapting to the condition of constant mobility, which is why only 15% of the 350,000 of them are in school. And unfortunately, this has not changed much during the past 1 or 2 decades. In Mexico, the educational system has expanded very much in the last 70 years, so there are less children and young people out of school. But unfortunately, learning has practically not improved since the year 2000, when standardized tests were first applied. With the young people in secondary education, it is perhaps understandable, because we are struggling with reaching sectors of the population who were not in school before, that are first-generation secondary school students. But unfortunately, this is also true at the primary level that reached almost universal coverage several decades ago. And this has to do with the fact that we are not achieving learning with those at the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid, or with minorities, which are also, unfortunately, at the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid. And well, how does this compare with the rest of the Latin American region? I would say that even though Mexico is one of the richest countries in the region, educationally, it is not at the top. The regional IIEP study, which is carried out by UNESCO, situates us just a little above the mean of Latin American and Caribbean countries. The test applied in 2018 shows no significant changes in learning since 2013, while other countries like Peru and Brazil did improve significantly between these 2 years. So that is my introduction. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Govinda, also
Yes.
on the question of defining LBOP at the local national level in India.
Thank you, Dan. In some ways, we are not very different from Mexico. We have the same kind of issue related to LBOP. But I would like to illustrate the situation in India with an example. About 3 decades ago, we went to a cluster of villages in India, located in a remote corner. And what we found, and the location was such that it was inhabited by traditionally marginalized groups. And what we found was that the schools were ill-equipped and the teachers were not very indifferent. In fact, that's the kind of situation. After 2 decades, we went to the same cluster of villages, and what did we find? The school infrastructure has slightly improved, but the other things are all exactly the same. No equipment, indifferent teachers, learning is not happening. And this group, what I call the traditionally marginalized groups, in fact, we have a separate paper in the book that we have brought out on this, is that they are also handicapped. They face multiple handicaps apart from all these things, not only economic handicap, but also language handicap. because they do speak a language which is not of the mainstream language where the teaching happens. So this is about 8 to 10% of people in India are in this category who are literally in the bottom of the pyramid, who are not really moving ahead at all, practically. That is one category. But then you have a vast mass of people, children, who are all over the country, across the schools. It is difficult to pinpoint and say who these are, but they are what I call silently excluded from learning. I say silently excluded because physically they are present in the school, but cognitively absent. Because at the end of 8 years, they do not learn anything actually at all. That is the state of many of the children. About 30% of the children of this category actually drop out over a period of 5 to 6 years after attending. And this is this bulk that happens is across the country, in fact. And the situation is so bad that if we look at the data on literacy among the young people, I mean those who are born in the post-Jomthian decades, the last 3 decades, you have about 10 to 12% young people are still illiterate, who should have been dealt with in the post-Jomthian decade. That is the seriousness. And when I say 30%, 40%, you should the number in absolute numbers, it is mind-boggling. We have about 200 million children in the compulsory education age group, and if you say 30%, it would mean that 60 million children are left out. The bottom is not a small bottom; it's very diverse, but at a very huge bottom that we are talking about. If you ask me, hasn't anything changed over the years? Yes, there has been a lot of investment that has been made, and so many programs have been done. National and international activities have been carried out. But what has happened is that the intensity as well as the speed with which it has been happening is so low that it has not been able to make a turnaround. My point is that unless we spend and we articulate our programs, which is beyond the threshold level, that things don't change. Particularly for the children in the bottom of the pyramid, this investment is too low to really make an impact and create a turnaround in their life system. That is what is happening. India, compared to other countries in the region, it's a risky proposition to compare with other countries in South Asian region, because South Asia as a whole is suffering from poor learning levels. But if we compare, I would say there are countries, in terms of policy-wise, India is doing very well. In fact, other countries actually follow India's model in terms of policy. But on the ground, sometimes you will find that there are countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and even Bhutan. They are going ahead much faster as compared to India in changing the ground reality. In fact, this is what is happening. Of course, for India, average is sometimes misleading, because you will find in one corner of the country, some states like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, where all children go to school, there is no problem at all. And then almost all of them complete their 10 years of schooling. Whereas you also have at the other end of the spectrum, some states like Bihar and UP, where probably there are more children outside the school than inside the school, if you take the full schooling period as such. You will find that the school dropouts are numerically concentrated in selected states. But when we come to learning at the bottom, if you are talking about, it is much wider phenomenon. It is across the country you find the number of children who are not learning is very huge. Some surveys have shown that about 50% of children who attend even 8 years of schooling are only at the level of grade 2 or grade 3. So that is the seriousness with which we need to really look at. Who are these children? It's not that we cannot make out. They are the children who are marginalized, traditionally marginalized, and those who are there who are silently excluded, who need to be really looked into. And in the early grades, we neglect them, and the result is that they become potential dropouts and eventually drop out of the school and remain illiterate. That is the situation. That's the way I would describe India's situation with respect to LBOP.
Thanks very much, Govinda. Very interesting and, of course, troubling too. John, over to you on the situation in Kenya from your perspective.
Thank you so much, Dan. And again, congratulations upon the launch of this book. At Zizi Afrique in Kenya and working with other partners in Tanzania and Uganda, we have taken this aspect of learning at the bottom of the pyramid by prioritizing those that are farthest. And we think it may offer good alignment if interventions can start from the back or from the bottom. In terms of the understanding of LBOP in Kenya, I think it's very similar to what you have had in Mexico and India. The sharp socioeconomic inequality and growing inequities, you will find that consistently children of the poorest quintile also post poorest results. And this applies to all the assessments, all the data that exists. The relationship between school success, completion and attainment and access to jobs is one interesting addition I can put. When you look at the youth and how they access opportunities to training, but also to jobs, you will find that more than half of youth accessing jobs is through social networks, knowing someone. And so this leads to kind of systematic, exacerbation of the situation facing youth who are from poorer, who are less educated, and who are less networked. When you look from recent studies, like one recent study by Usawa Agenda or the UESO assessment, indicated that girls with disability are at the very bottom. So when you rank, even the bottom itself has layers, and girls with disability are the most disadvantaged in terms of access to education. And when you consider attendance, around 16% of them don't attend school at all, compared to a national average of less than 4%. From the UESO assessment, I think, as Sylvia says, there is little progress in terms of improvement of learning, but the progress is too slow. From recent data, you find that around 40% of children in grade 4 are able to read at grade 3 level. And those that are completing primary, a significant proportion of them have not acquired foundational literacy and numeracy. So at the bottom of the pyramid are children from the poorest families, those with disabilities, but also a very interesting differentiation between children attending public and attending private schools. Those attending public schools are significantly facing disadvantage. Before and now, we find that there is evidence that COVID has made the situation worse. There is a documentation of a 3.2% decline in school enrollment over the COVID period, even though in Kenya, the closure was not as long as in Mexico or in other parts of our country, like in Uganda. So many children also move from private to public schools, again, directing to the bottom. So the bottom may have expanded significantly over the COVID period, owing to closure of small schools, but also the economic difficulties that have been experienced by a significant proportion of families. So certainly things are different now. The short school terms now that have come as a result of wanting to recover lost time, which is a response by government that is laudable, is good. But again, children who are unable to handle that pressure are likely also to be those at the bottom. And so those that were behind are likely to fall even further behind, unless if something is done. So comparing Kenya with our neighbors in the region, of course, Kenya is not among the worst in sub-Saharan Africa. You find that we are ranked, I think, among the top 5 or so, behind Mauritius, Seychelles, Tunisia, South Africa. But then we don't like comparing ourselves with the worst. I think it is better to benchmark with those that have come up with ways of resolving the crisis. So when you look at Uganda, for instance, Uganda had, again, one of the longest closures globally. They reopened schools only this January. So 2 years, nearly 2 years of closure. and as compared to the 9 months in Kenya and only 3 months in Tanzania. So the assessments depict Kenya's education as better, improving, even though the progress is too slow. And there are little documented changes at the bottom. Indeed, the bottom may be becoming worse. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks very much, John. And there's already, of course, issues to discuss both within and across the 3 countries presented. But I'd like to push us forward into our next thematic question, which in fact ties in with what you've just been saying, each of you, and maybe go back to you, Sylvia. And the next piece is, in the work that you did and you published for this book, what would you say are the 1 or 2 research findings that we should know about, and that may also link back to your comments? I'm saying for everybody, their comments on your own national situation. What does the most recent research show that's relevant to this conversation? Sylvia? You need to sound.
Yes, thank you. Yes, well, thank you very much. And I think it's important that one of the first findings that I want to discuss is the fact that we know something about the causes of this inequality in learning. And it's important to know the causes if we're thinking about implementation, because we have to come back to these causes, no? So this is, I think, an important finding. And one of the causes is the way resources are distributed, no? Financial resources, but also human, material, educational. Dan was talking a bit about that before. In Mexico, the rich receive more, the poor less, when it should be entirely the other way around, because it is the poor that require more resources in order to attain educational results. But it goes the other way around. The fact is that the poverty of the population is met with a poverty on the supply side. Poor infrastructure, teachers with less experience, as Dan was saying, more irregular operation of schools in rural, indigenous, and poor areas. And so this is a perverse synergy that gives way inevitably to poverty of results. The Mexican educational system is reproducing and exacerbating existing external inequalities. And I would remind you that Latin America is the most unequal continent in the world. And it is not representing a vehicle for social mobility and greater well-being. And that is a tragedy, actually, because that is what education is supposed to do. You know? And another very important cause is a homogeneous treatment of a very diverse population, which I think is true in most of our countries. Our population is diverse, but there is, in our case, a national curriculum that is the same for all sectors of the population, even the indigenous children that represent 10% of our population, and that have their own language, their own culture, which is not respected or strengthened through education. A third cause is teacher education. We know that teacher education is very important, but in the case of our country, it is not oriented towards serving the bottom of the pyramid. For example, 46% of our primary schools are multi-grade. So there are less than one teacher per grade. Teachers are not trained, however, when they are trained in normal schools, they are not trained to teach in multi-grade schools. So what they do usually is divide the school day into little bits to cover the curriculum for each of the grades. And of course, the consequence is that children do not learn because they have very little instruction time. And the support system could be the solution to all of these problems. But it is a problem in itself because it is bureaucratic and it is not centered on pedagogical support to teachers and to schools. So teachers are very much left on their own. That is the first finding that I would like to depict. And the second one has to do with the policy of education. In the chapter on the case of Mexico in the book, we describe policies that have been put in place and evaluated and proven to be successful in improving learning. For example, cash transfer programs were very successful for increasing coverage and preventing dropout. Though they have not had an impact on learning because the supply side was left untouched, improving teaching at the schools they attended was clearly the next step. However, it was interrupted. Another example that we put in the book is the PMLE. This is a program that selected low-performing schools and gave the teachers special attention, which had very good results. And a third example is a program that was developed in 2 states, because Mexico is a federal country. This was developed in 2 states And this program put emphasis on attendance, permanence, and learning, and used a targeting strategy that had observable results. And the fourth is the full-time school program that has shown to improve learning among the poorest because it also gives meals. Unfortunately, all of these programs, the four programs, have ceased to exist and have been substituted by scholarships of all types, but mainly universal, scholarships that are universal, and by cash transfers to communities. The communities then decide on how they want to spend the money on the school. But with this strategy of universal coverage with cash, the two lower income deciles of the population are the ones that have seen the greatest decrease in financing through government programs. So it has worked the other way around. Education policy at this moment of time is not oriented towards serving the ones that need it the most and is definitely not based on evidence. So that is definitely a problem. And the implications are that there are very many things to do. Resources are important. Reverting the criteria for distributing them would be key. But what really matters is what goes on in the classrooms. We have to abandon the one-size-fits-all model and diversify pedagogical strategies according to the population. Teachers have to be supported with effective inclusive pedagogical practices. A support system is needed to accompany them in their transition towards new pedagogies. And we have to take advantage of the findings from research on what is effective for achieving learning among those at the bottom of the pyramid and put it in operation. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks. Well, you've opened up so many boxes there. And I think for so many people in diverse countries around the world, I'll be interested to hear what Govinda and John Mugo also have to add to that. So Govinda, over to you. You're on silent still. You're on mute. Still muted.
Yeah, sorry.
There you go.
I think what research has been telling us in India. One broad observation that emerges from researchers is that our policies have been focusing on more on macro level issues, as if India is all same and ignoring the diversity that exists. Instead of that, it says that we need to become more decentralized. We need to go down and then look at the diversity and make adaptations in our policies to the local conditions. It's one of the major issues that come up, that because we have been having pan-Indian programs supported for some time by the international agencies also, which has resulted in over standardization and over centralization of thinking. And now we are realizing that we need to decentralize and then de-standardize these things and focus. The result of this approach has been that the attention to individual schools has not come. That transforming the individual schools has not come. There are many schools which have remained poorly equipped. It has remained because we have a standardized inputs that we are providing. They have not been able to change themselves. 10 years ago, when we adopted the Right to Education Act in India as a fundamental human right, the legislation specified the basic minimum that every school should have in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of human resources, in terms of academic resources, so that even the poorer children will also get at least the minimum that is necessary in a school. But 10 years down the line, we find that even now, only around 12% of the schools satisfy all the requirements. And worse, around 50% of the schools don't meet even 30% of the benchmark that have been there in the right to education, which is considered a basic entitlement according to legislation passed by the parliament, yet it is not available. This is one of the basic findings that is coming, is that we are not attending to improving our schools at the ground level. We are talking more at the policy and macro level. Second that is coming up is that research also shows that there is very poor oversight of what happens in the school. What do teachers do? Do teachers really teach? And how long do they teach? And the studies are showing that the time on task, what the World Bank calls the time on task, that the actual instructional hours that are spent, which is also specified by the Right to Education Act, that how many hours in a year it should be spent and how many days it should be spent. We have not been able to enforce this. And who are the people who suffer most because of this non-enforcement are the children at the bottom of the pyramid, the poorer sections of the society. This is the second very important thing that is emerging. And we conduct tests. And how do we expect outcomes to improve if the inputs and processes are not happening at all in the school? After all, there is a causal relationship between what happens in the school and what children are learning. Second point I want to make, during the last 2 decades, we had observed that a large number of parents are moving their children from public schools to private schools in search of what I call functioning schools. I don't say quality schools because many private schools quality are poorer than even government schools, but they are better functioning. And so in search of functioning, research also shows that the parents are ready to sacrifice even their basic comforts in order to ensure that the children get to attend a fee charging private school if it is functioning. This has been happening over the last 2 decades. Gradually from which used to be about 5 to 8% had gone up to about 30% children going to private schools. But what has happened now with the pandemic, it has been jolted. In fact, literally we are jolted from this because a large number of small private schools that are functioning closed down. We, not only in Mexico, we closed down our schools for 2 years. 2 years when you close down, many of the schools which are dependent on the fees, they closed down, teachers left, the schools were closed down also. This is a very serious issue that has come. And second, related to this is that a large number of children of migrant workers who used to work in urban areas and all, those children went back to villages. So they left their school here and they have no school there. This is a very, very difficult situation that has come. And there are many other side issues that are emerging also, problems. Because some of the issues on which we thought that we have got a handle on it, like child labor, we are able to control. Now it is found that the child trafficking, child abuse, child labor, they are all getting resurfaced in many of these poorer localities and all. That is a very complex situation has emerged because of the COVID during the last 2 years. And the problems of the learning at the bottom of the pyramid is more accentuated because of that. The third point that I want to make and stop here is that during the last 2 years, a lot of alternate technology-based learning platforms emerged. In some ways, at the macro level, it gave a sense that there has been some sort of a continuity. Although schools are closed, we have been able to maintain some sense of continuity in education process. But when many studies have been done now, analytical studies have been done, what has been found is that this sense that we got is only a limited sense. And it is limited sense and also limited to a small proportion of the population. Children at the bottom of the pyramid never got to really see many of these things. In fact, they were completely left out of those things. Actually, the studies have revealed a much deeper divide, that is a digital divide that is happening, which is actually accentuating, which is increasing the already existing inequalities in the education sector. In India, we have a small sector which is highly flourishing, and they have no problem. They are comparable with any international school, and the products are excellent. In fact, who come, which is fairly large in number internationally, but for within India, it is still a very, very small proportion. About 20,000 schools of 1.5 million schools. That's what we are talking about. This is what Amartya Sen has called. We are in the process of creating privileged excellence. They are excellent, but it's privileged excellence. And the large bottom is completely left out. And the COVID, the school closure, and these things have actually revealed a much deeper divide, which is deepening further because of these things and leaving out the bottom of the period. This is what research is showing. We need to act at that point. Thank you. That's what I wanted to share.
Okay. Thank you so much, Govinda. Over to you, John.
Thank you so much, Dan. Again, findings are very similar to what Sylvia and Govinda have described. We were very privileged in this book to have 4 chapters dedicated to the Kenyan case, and I encourage people to read those chapters to understand the depth of the findings that we have described for Kenya. Now, there has been progress over the time, and we really laud our government because there has been effort to confront the crisis, even the challenge of equity, even when it is really truly difficult to bridge equity. While, of course, government policies have focused more on relevance and access and less on quality. And yet we know that it is aspects of quality actually that drive inequality and the lack of success for children at the bottom more than anything else. So a new curriculum, the so-called competency-based curriculum, and a new curriculum even for youth training that is focusing on competencies has been under implementation even through the COVID period. Aspects of expanding access have been through universalizing secondary education, which I think is a unique move for the Kenyan education system to look for 100% transition between the 8-year primary into the 4-year secondary education with, I think, tremendous success at that level. There has been efforts to give scholarships as a way of bridging the transition from primary to secondary for children from the poorest quintile, even when that is confronted again by a myriad of challenges. And again, the investment is only able to help to support a small proportion of the needed children. Now, looking at the findings, allow me to focus on the chapter that we did on children with disabilities. We analyzed the results of around 13,000 students with disabilities over 4 years at both end of primary and end of secondary examinations. Looking at 4 disabilities, those that are blind, with low vision, those that are deaf, and with physical disabilities. And one of the findings is that when you look at students with disabilities, 76% of them are actually overage. And so this points now to especially 2 things. One is a delay in enrollment of these children to school, which in effect now affects their esteem, their confidence, and other things that even affect the cognitive development. And the other is the fact that those with severe disabilities have to go to boarding facilities that are normally farther from home. And so that delay is pragmatic more than anything else, because parents cannot send very young children far away from where they are. Overall, learners with disabilities scored an average of about 20 percentage points below their counterparts without disabilities at both primary and secondary levels. So again, these are contributing to a cycle of disadvantage for those at the bottom. And this is more at the secondary than at the primary level. But when now you start peeling the layers, and this is one of our findings, that the bottom has layers. And when you peel those off, you discover a little bit more. For instance, being deaf contributes to a drop in attainment of up to 19 percentage points at primary school and nearly 35 percentage points in attainment at the secondary level. So even though we could describe learners with disabilities at the bottom, even that bottom has another bottom, and the deaf at the very, very bottom. And so when you look at the implications now of this finding, we find that both the instructional and assessment accommodations that are available are far too inadequate to bridge equity for those at the bottom. And looking at the learning of deaf students in particular, the aspects of language deprivation. So we talked about language, and Sylvia mentioned this in respect to minorities, ethnic minorities. But you find that the deaf, sign language is also a pertinent element of marginalization. So the blanket examination and assessment accommodations, one would ask, who benefits from time extension, for instance? We have a 30-minute time extension in examinations, but does this benefit all students uniformly that have disabilities, or do we need to question it? And the other is, what is the effect of language deprivation in educating the deaf, and what options are available to us? The need to reconfigure the home and the school environments to create language-rich contexts to support the learning and development of children, but also revisiting the exam accommodations and adaptations to suit the learning context and not just a uniform kind of a blanket accommodation. So these are some of the implications that we are discussing in this chapter, and I would love to dig deeper into them in terms of looking at the implications. Back to you, Dan.
Thanks. So we're about ready to move to theme 3, but before we do that, maybe if I could inject one variation on the last 2 themes we covered, which are what is LBOP and what kind of research you found in your papers for this book. If you had, and I'm going to maybe go back to you, Sylvia, just a quick question. I'm going to intrude this in our normal schedule. If you had a doctoral student studying education in Mexico, and by extension India and also Kenya, and you had funding for them to go and do research, what's the most important topic you'd have that student do? If you could, what do you think a person could do? And if there are any students listening in, maybe here's an opportunity for you. So back to you, Sylvia. Just a quick snapshot. What would you have them do?
One thing that I have always wanted to do, and I think that if I had a student that would be willing to do that, it would be fantastic. We have said that the children that are poor are the ones that are not learning, but that is not always true. In all of our results of standardized tests, there is always a very small percentage, a very, very small percentage of poor children that are doing very well, or poor schools that are doing very well with most of their children. And I think that is what we want to find out about. No, what are these schools doing or these teachers doing in order to have them be exceptions? Because the thing is that this is not something that is determinate. No, it doesn't necessarily have to be like this. It can be completely different. And these schools and these teachers are showing us that it can be different, that it isn't deterministic. So what I would really like to do is to go into those schools and to see what teachers in the schools are doing, because they are in very poor conditions, the same as all the rest, but they are achieving results at level 4. No, we have 4 levels in the standardized test, and they are achieving results at level 4. Of course, it's 0.9% of the children, no, or 1.5% of the children, but there is always a small percentage there. So I would really, because that I think would illuminate us on implementation. No?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I hope one or more students are listening in on this for you. We tend in psychology call that positive deviance. What's the case of the people who actually do succeed under most difficult circumstances? Govinda, your 1-minute snapshot, doctoral student, what should she or he do?
What I would see is that actually the schools have to become more flexible. I would have liked the school to be much more flexible, not too rigid in terms of what ought to be learned, and related to the life of the children. There's so much of diversity that you find and so much of richness that you find in the children. And the schools, the way we have been running the schools today, they killed all the richness that is there in the lives of the children as such, and put them all into a straight jacket box. I think we need to really change this. Basically, our problem has been we are trying to really push children into a narrow jacket, and children are resisting, but we say that, they are dropping out. I would like my own experience also tells me that I would have liked that I've been allowed to really be more creative rather than being put into this straight jacket. That's the way I look at it.
So we have a scholarship for you, Govinda. At Penn, we'll take you on. You can do a second dissertation. Anyway, John, over to you. Quick snapshot. What would you like to see done as priority?
Yeah. I am torn between 2 things. One, The difference we know when you look at the learning outcomes of private and public schools in Kenya and East Africa in general, you find that private schools are up there and public schools are down here. The differentiation is not in infrastructure, is not in any range of inputs, but it points to levels of accountability. And yet it seems there is much higher accountability for teachers and learning in the private school than in the public school. But then there are teachers and head teachers that have figured accountability out in the public system. So I think I would love to employ the positive deviance approach to study these ones that have discovered an accountability mechanism for the public system and how it's working for them and what could be scaled or not. And the other is that point that Govinda has raised. I think we have a narrow view of learning, and this is costing success for our children. I think cognitive is good, but developing the mind without the heart and the body is I think not success in itself. So how can we pursue holistic and how can parents and teachers get to adopt a more holistic approach to learning more than just the narrow academic mean score with which we judge our children? Thanks.
Thank you so very much. And let me take this moment to also, I see the chats are coming in. That's good. Put your questions in chat, and we will have time. We're going to leave sufficient time for a good Q&A afterwards. I'll keep us on schedule. I'm going to move quickly now over to our third thematic question, which is maybe a more difficult one in some ways. And that is, at a national policy level, what kind of implementation is needed from your perspective, from your research, and what are the chief obstacles that have to be overcome? I mean, if you had your minister sitting next to you in this room, this virtual room, what would you say are two or three of the most important needs and priorities at a national policy level, in your view, and what are the obstacles you'd say, well, here's what's stopping what we're trying to do? Sylvia, back to you. You're on mute still.
I would like to start by saying that I want to answer this question at two levels, at the micro and at the macro level. And for the micro level, I would like to give an example. In 2013, there was a contest in the state of Guerrero, which is one of the poorest states in Mexico, that would give an award to primary schools that had quality programs. And I was asked to visit a school in a very monolingual indigenous area that had prioritized values education and had achieved a very impressive transformation of the school as a place where children were happy in. However, I went to visit it, and this was true, but I discovered that children in the 6th grade had not learned Spanish and were not going to be able to survive in secondary school, where all teaching is in Spanish. At that time, I had a PhD student that worked in the US in dual immersion programs, and asked her to go to the school and tell them about that methodology. The supervisor, an indigenous linguist specializing in his own language, attended that meeting and decided that he wanted to apply the dual immersion methodology to all the schools he supervised, which were about 10. And the neighboring supervisors found out about the plan and joined the project, which consisted of dividing the school day into 2 halves and teaching 1 half of the day in one language and the other half in the other, with different teachers in different classrooms and no translation. This project has been in operation for the last 6 years in 21 schools with important results. The most important for me is that teachers are much happier with what they do. They have found sense in what they do. Children are learning and valuing both languages very early. In the 2nd grade, they are already writing and reading in both. Cultural content is part of the curriculum, especially, but not only during the Indigenous Language Half Day. And teachers have had summer courses for most of these years, with the exception of the pandemic years, where they have learned about pedagogical strategies that they can apply to improve learning. Parents and communities are participating in the school, and this experience, which is very interesting, and I think it's really it's at the front of what should be done with indigenous schools, has never been visited by the educational authorities of the state, even though they know of its existence. It operates in spite of education norms and authorities. So this is an example of an innovation that was carried out with very little resources, no support from the government, but that really catered to the needs of the children and of the communities. And this is what I think should be, this is the sensibility that I think we need at the political level. But then at the macro level, I have already mentioned this program of attendance permanence learning. This was carried out in the state of Puebla between 2011 and 2017 with 3 goals. The first is that all girls and boys from 3 to 17 should be in school, that all students have to complete secondary education, and that each student should acquire at least the basic knowledge established in the curriculum. The strategies in this project were targeting to reduce inequality gaps, articulation between levels and institutions, implementation and communication to ensure that everyone involved understood and agreed about these goals, and accompaniment, monitoring to identify risks and opportunities at the right time. 200 primaries and 200 secondaries were selected for their low results, and 100 preschools that sent their graduates, so to say, to these primary schools. Participation was voluntary, supervisors were trained, and an academy of supervisors was created. And the results were at the ranking level, no? But Puebla, which is the state where it worked, ranked first in math and third in language of all the 32 states in Mexico in 2016. And that came up from 20 and from 4 years before. And this is in spite of Puebla being one of the poorest states in Mexico. And it has managed to remain in high ranks in 2019. So this was a sustainable innovation. Secondary schools at the bottom of the pyramid in math were in the last quartile in 2013 and above the national mean in 2015 in both mathematics and language. So something like this is what I would be expecting for this focus on learning at the bottom of the pyramid from educational policy.
Okay, we put a lot in that answer. Thank you very much. Govinda, over to you on if you had the Minister of MHRD next to you or Education Secretary next to you, how would you look at what would you say in terms of policy implementation? What needs to be done?
I would focus on 4 specific points that India should really look into if you want to move ahead. One is we find that when it comes to children at the bottom of the pyramid, they are already predisposed to difficulties in learning when they come to primary schools because of the poor nutritional level with which they come. So I would say one of the most important attention that India has to pay is to strengthen the nourishment of the children in the early stage. That means that early childhood development should be one of our top priorities if you want to, because India has the largest number in terms of proportion, about 40% children are malnourished. That's what the UNICEF reports say. Although it is improving, it is still very bad. So I think one of the top implementation, if you want to tackle the problem of the children at the bottom of the pyramid, their learning, improve their learning capabilities when they come to school so that, they are not malnourished. And that is one. We have large-scale programs of nourishment and nutrition, but I think it is not adequate enough to really make the kind of impact it should make. This is the first one. Second, I think, we have to really look at schools and their simple, straightforward functioning. Straighten the functioning of the schools in terms of how many hours they should function, how many days they should function, what ought to happen in it. There is not adequate attention paid to school functioning. The problem is that too often we are getting diverted into public school functioning from private schools are increasing, they are doing better, and there are more research that is being done about private schools today than about the public schools, in fact. And this distraction is not going to solve the problem of children at the bottom. Because 70% children even today in India, they go to public schools, and The bottom, if you are considering bottom 30, 40, would never know what is a private school at all, in fact. That is the kind of situation in which. So it is important that, the government really looks at the bottom and strengthen simple, straightforward functioning of the schools. Our implementation should focus on that end, the lower end, and improve those schools. The third point that I want to say is that the schools that we have created at the lower end of the pyramid is that they are like fragile ladders in which too many people are trying to climb a single ladder, which is breaking down, and the result is the children are falling off. This is the kind of situation that we have created. It's not that we have not done anything. We need hand-holding for schools in the local level, in the poorer communities that are there. We have created what we call cluster resource centers and all those things. In fact, during the last 2 decades, plenty of them have been done, but they are also bureaucratized. I think decentralization and debureaucratization, destandardization is what is required. There is need for much greater innovation and autonomy, and what I would say creates space for creativity. It is not that we don't have experience. India has a large number of case studies of innovative experiences, outstanding innovative experiences shared internationally, showing how things can change at the ground level if we work. But they are all participatory in nature, flexible, where teachers and the local community have actively participated. Local administrators have participated. Civil society representatives have participated. It is not that we don't know what to do, but the standardization and bureaucratization is killing India's effort to really bring about change. If I was there, I would really promote not one innovation, and I won't talk about scaling up. Rather, I would say there should be 1,000 flowers that should bloom. That is a better idea for India than really one good flower everywhere growing the same thing. That is the last point that I want to say. The largest challenge is the quality of teachers. Because of the poor quality, it is not today's creation. If you look at the test results of the Pratham, which has been doing the All India Educational Surveys, even in 2006, the results were the same, and 2020 results are not very different. The poor quality schools and colleges have produced people who have become teachers. It is not their fault. Those people who do not have the capacity to really handle difficult situations, diversity that comes into classroom because of the children at the bottom of the pyramid who have multiple handicaps with which they come to the classroom, physical and social and economic handicaps. They don't know how to handle this. It is not their fault, but they have been products of a system which is already not in a very good shape. Schools and colleges. I would say that I think that we need to really, implementation should focus on teachers, strengthening the teacher capabilities and producing right kind of teachers. That's what I want to say.
Thank you very much. And I want to also make note of a term that was used here, I think for the first time, but implicit in almost all the comments, and that is the sort of tension between local focus and scaling up, a term that Govinda used in his presentation. I think something we'll want to come back to later on. But first, over to you, John, on policy implementation. And I know you have a good friend and colleague who's now in the ministry at a high level. What would you say to her, if I even don't mention her name? But go ahead, Kenya.
Thanks, Dan. Allow me to make 3 points concerning this policy implementation. My first reflection is around the incentivizing school leadership. So as Govinda says, change happens. For us to make progress, change must happen, not in the ministry in terms of changing policies, but in the classroom, in how learning and teaching happens. And we have seen in our experience at SDZ Afrique a lot of innovation through school leadership. And I think we don't incentivize innovative and effective school leaders, and we don't tell their stories enough. For instance, the default form when we go to assess children in a school is for the head teacher and the teachers to deny and say these are not our results. And this happened to me even last week when we went to a village, assessed children and took those results to the school, and the head teacher said, no, these are not our children. And when we have implemented such methods that we know are tested world over and would improve learning. I would give a case of this one school. It's called Mwiva Primary School, where we went and implemented this teaching at the right level method with success in neighboring schools. This head teacher came and saw. And rather than just focusing on it for some children, he adopted this school-wide, integration of reading time under trees, during time. So as long as we implement policies that are focused on teaching the curriculum and teaching the official, then the bottom will not change. So I think focusing on these innovations and incentivizing and telling stories of school leaders who are trying to make a difference, I think would be one thing. The role of technology has been highlighted. And as it was earlier mentioned, we need to take caution because technology can also be a driver of inequality. But then when you look at now some of the most challenging and complex challenges we have in our education in sub-Saharan Africa today, I think technology offers a lot of leverage, and we have to adopt an incremental approach in terms of leveraging on technology to bring learning to those children that may never attend school, those girls that have to be married early, or those boys that are following animals and will never get to school. What role could technology play, and local teachers, even untrained volunteers play in getting at least these children to acquire, a foundational learning? So this I think role of technology needs to be re-examined, and policies targeted at supporting this in an incrementalist fashion. And the last point I would like to make is the role of evidence and evidence-based policy review. Many times we push all our resources and capacities to implementing policies without budgeting enough for continuous generation of evidence and adaptation based on what we know is working and is not working. And I would draw on the call by Lant Pritchett here, differentiating between what he calls incrementalism and strategic incrementalism, in that we have, at the same time we are implementing, also be generating evidence that helps us to answer the question, what is working and what is not working, and using evidence on what is working as to support strategic incrementalism, rather than just implementing and then after a whole 7 years coming back to check and see that actually we thought we were headed to a certain direction and we ended up somewhere else. So these are the kind of things I would explore, Dan, with that friend of mine.
Yes, thank you very much, John. And there is a lot to comment on, of course, with each of you. I would just like to add on your last comment on strategic implementalism. I wanted you to say, and I think maybe you implied it, but I wanted you to say for whom, because part of our problem, as you said and the other speakers have said, it depends which part of the population we're talking about when we look at evidence. And part of the problem, of course, we have all in the LBOP initiative come to grips with is large amounts of evidence we have is for those who are the most privileged, and far less is available for those who need it the most. I just needed to say that because for us, that's sort of de rigueur, as the French would say, but it isn't obvious sometimes in conversations with high-level policy officials. So in our fourth theme, and given the time, I'm going to ask you to be very brief. The fourth theme, for those of you who arrived maybe on the late side, is around what types of capacity building and commitments are needed to move the ball forward on LBOP kinds of issues under the UN Goal 4, Sustainable Development Goal 4. And if I could limit you at this point to just a 2-minute commentary, because we're waiting for Karen Mundy for her discussant remarks. So back over to you, Sylvia, just a quick response on, you're sitting next to the minister again. Here's what you need to do in terms of capacity building. What should she do?
Okay, well, thank you. Well, very quickly, I would say that the first thing that we have to do is to prioritize educational equity, but understanding equity as equity and learning, and quality of education. It's equity and quality that we want. And this has to be done taking into account that we need a systemic approach. Because, well, first of all, it's very important to realize that we have a diverse community and that one size does not fit all. So I would expect from a decision maker to realize that and not to have uniform solutions. And then I think a 4-tiered strategy would be necessary at the state level, at the meso structure where the supervisors are that can be very close to schools. I think they are very important. Of course, school leadership, as John already mentioned, and at the classroom level. We have to strengthen this support system that is in the meso level, and education supervisors and aides, and we have to diversify strategies according to the population. We need intercultural bilingual education in our case because we have indigenous population. We need multi-grade methodology. We need inclusive pedagogy. We need to prioritize foundational skills, and we need to support teachers for adapting contents to context and to children. And another thing that and John mentioned it, school has to be a good place to be. It has to be a respectful, secure, caring place, because I think 50% of the learning relies on that, because if not, children are not in a disposition to learn. And also the place to learn has to be dignified. I think that is why I think we need a systemic approach. And regarding capacity building, quickly at the level of policy design, but particularly of implementation, we need capacity building centered at this meso level and at the school level. And I think we need close links with teacher education institutions. We need to make use of research at all levels, use of data and monitoring. And of course, we need resources to support a local team to carry out capacity building, to develop guides and materials, to finance visits to schools at the meso level, and for monitoring and evaluation. And those resources that cannot be reallocated by state decision makers would have to come from somewhere else. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, as always. So interesting. Govinda, over to you.
Yeah, there's very similar to what has been said. I think everyone would agree that we need more investment, but strategic investment. What was said, I like the strategic incrementalism, but it's all depends upon what you said earlier, that where you focus the strategic incrementalism. Will you spread it thin across, bit by bit, everywhere would you send? Or in my view, the focus has to be on those schools where the children of the poorest of the poor go, and then invest in those schools and transform those schools. That is the incrementalism that I would like to really see, strategic incrementalism, rather than only spending little bit everywhere and changing little bit everywhere. That has been the problem in India, and I hope we will be able to change that perspective. Second, I would also add to that is that we should give up our idea of stop looking for cheap alternatives for poor children. We have done this in the world, in India, definitely, all over, that for the poor children, you give a poor school and an cheap alternative will do for them because we don't have money. I think we need to stop talking about cheap alternatives. We need to do, as just now what Sylvia said, these should be comfortable, secure places. We are not talking about fancy places, but it should be austere, but yet secure and comfortable places where they can spend 6 hours in a day, after all. So that's what we need to really do. Second, I think, I reiterate what John said about leadership building, on which we need to really spend an enormous amount of money. We are not investing adequately on that in India. But I would like to add here that leadership, I don't look at only in terms of head teacher training programs. This is what India has done. Leadership, when we said, there is a huge head teacher training program done across the country. But that's not what I'm looking at. Leadership can be inside the school as well as outside the school in the community. It is the change agents that we are looking into, mentors that we are looking at, the champions who will transform the school that we are looking into and build their capacities, support those champions who can really act with the school, inside the school, alongside the school, and change the school, and hold this process of supporting the champions for a sustainable period of time. It's a long cycle change because the schools change over a longer period of time, not in a short period. 1 year, 2 years is not going to happen. A longer period of time, so that the habits and behaviors of the people in the school and who run the school changes in a sustainable fashion. Problem with many of our innovations that, we bring about these things, mentors and all, introduce them for 3 months. Oh, see, I have demonstrated it can change, and then we withdraw them. I think this is the second point that I want to say where we need to really. Third, of course, I have already repeated, I will not repeat that, is in terms of the teachers. If we are policy commitment is teachers. I would say that's the most important thing to say. Fourth, I would like to say, there has been a craze in the recent past in India for external large-scale testing. Every state has initiated large-scale testing programs of children, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. Everybody is tested left and right everywhere. I am not against testing, but I would say that we should strengthen not just testing, but the feedback loop to the teachers and the schools so that the learning levels are known and they are improved. But this testing has to be done, this introduction of testing process has to be done in a way that it is more individualized to the school and non-threatening to both children and teachers. I find that this testing has become some sort of a ghost, which is bothering the children. They don't know what they are going to face. The teachers are bothered about it. I think we need to change this. I'm not against tests, but it's the feedback loop that is more important than the test results themselves. League tables have not made any impact on Indian schools. In fact, league tables of states, which state is doing better, which district is doing better, has not made any difference to learning levels of children. It is, if we are talking testing, learning has to improve, and we are talking about learning as a fundamental right, a human right. The people are talking about it, the right for learning that should be there, not right to education, it's right for learning. If you're talking about right, the learning as a right, not just as a welfare measure, I think every school has to change and every learner has to change. That is the way
Govinda, I've got to.
Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much. That is really important. I'm sorry to stop, but John, over to you because we're looking at the clock now.
Yeah, there are 3 quick points, Dan. One is around funding. When you look at Kenya, I think we are among the highest spenders, 25% of the annual fiscal budget for the country, around 6% of the GDP. It's really high. So in terms of the proportion of resources, it may not go higher. But there has been conversation around differentiated funding and building those capacities, because this flat rate capitation does not work for the bottom. And so I think experimenting with more equity focused financing models for education and being bolder and more affirmative towards it, I think is something that Kenya must try to do. The second point is around inclusive education. When you look at most of our countries in Africa, we have been careful because of the implications. I mean, we are still battling with the basic universal access. And so when you look at children with special needs and disabilities, what kind of inclusive education would work in context rather than a transfer from, the Western context of what inclusive education is. But the question is, how can children at the bottom, especially those with disabilities and special needs, access better and more teachers for them, for learning to work for them? And the last thing is around the capacity for evidence generation and use as part of a policy implementation. I think we need to be implementing budgeting for evidence generation and use as much as we are budgeting for implementation, and that capacity needs to shift. If that shifted, then I think nurturing that culture of evidence generation, translation, use, while moving on with implementation might make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John, and thank you all so far, and for the participants hanging in there. This is a good time to write your chats after we've had these very interesting and sometimes provocative comments from various of the panelists. It's now time for Karen, if you can join back with us. I know you've been in the background there with your comments as discussant on our webinar today. And then if those, after this, we'll go to Q&A. We've been collecting some of the questions. We'll go to Q&A for back to the panelists with your Q&A. So keep them coming in the chat. Karen?
Thanks, Dan. And I'll keep my comments reasonably short because I want to make sure that the audience, those who have put questions in the chat, have a chance to also be heard. Well, let me just give a summary and appreciation to all the panelists. I think we've heard quite a bit, a really great diagnostic from each of the country contexts that you studied about the reproduction of inequality in the school system itself and how schools themselves are in fact acting as perhaps barriers by not paying attention to children at the bottom of the pyramid. And I really appreciated in particular the wide range of intersecting disadvantages that were covered in your presentations, not just socioeconomic status, but disadvantage based on indigeneity, based on gender, based on disability. So really a big thanks for that. One thing that was raised, I think, in 2 out of the 3 presentations, and I think it's so important, which is that this additional layer of disadvantage that has come out of the COVID pandemic. We're hearing lots of different ways of framing this challenge, this sort of learning loss challenge. But I think it's actually better framed in the way that you all have discussed it as this degradation of learning equity because of COVID itself. So it isn't so much that kids lost learning they might already have had, but it is that equity has been further undermined because of the COVID experience. You all highlighted the importance of the supply side of and the quality of education. I think that one thing that's music to those of us who are planners, music to our ears, is that the allocation of resources does matter. And of course it matters. It matters whether resources such as teachers or good, strong school leaders or good middle level community district leaders, whether they're distributed to areas, regions with high levels of poverty or other kinds of disadvantage. It matters that teachers themselves are trained and that they have the right supports. And that came out very strongly, very, very clearly across all of the presentations. And I think, again, very important. And from a planning point of view, just getting around that equity of resource allocation as essential for learning equity. I think it's very important. It's very fundamental. There was a planner in the chat who asked, something about what should a planner really take away? And to me, for planners, this is the thing that we need to take away. But perhaps what I would say then in conclusion, which is almost in a way a kind of challenge to all 3 of you, you all gave a kind of multiple and very complex picture of what kind of interventions and capacity would be needed to deliver those interventions to solve it. And it struck me right away that, well, we all seem very confident that we know what are the things we need in order to improve this situation, but that they're almost so easy to understand that it's surprising that leaders don't pick up these interventions or that they don't have the sustained focus to implement them. And I wondered why. Why is it that since we know sort of what we'd like to see happen, how to overcome some of the challenges of learning equity, that it's so difficult to see those kinds of interventions implemented? Now, all of you gave different kinds of answers to that. One was, if there were more accountability and measurement and monitoring built into the system, if there was more leadership, if there were more middle tier and school level capacity and supports. The one thing that no one spoke to, and I think this is something that planners and international development actors often neglect, is the political economy. So what is it in the system that's a deep cultural change that is needed to ensure that the political economy shifts. And I'm very much interested in some of the recent research that shows that teachers and leaders at every level of the system have very fixed mindsets about the ability of children to learn. And that fixed mindset, in fact, creates learning organizations that don't learn themselves, that don't really build in the capacity to learn into the overall system. So that's just a general comment. I was excited to hear the debate or discussion about capacity building, because IIEP's central mission, of course, is to strengthen the capacity of ministries of education to plan and to manage systems better. And so much of what you've suggested has been very useful to IIEP as we try to really embody that mission. So, Dan, I think I'm going to leave it there and then open to you to take questions from the floor. But again, thank you to all the panelists for a really stimulating strategic debate. It wasn't so much a debate because nobody seemed to disagree with one another yet, but I think in future we must try to really debate more thoroughly this question about political economy and also about implementation, because you all gave a very broad menu. And I wonder if there were one capacity that you could build going out the gate tomorrow, what would it be? And I think there we might end up with some debate. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Karen, very much. And I'm going to start by having people, as we say over here in the US, throw the ball back at you, since you're the most recent one to raise the questions. I'd like to focus on your last couple of comments, particularly the one about, I hadn't really heard it used so much about the fixed mindset. I know there's this whole field on fixed mindsets in psychology of learning and so on, but you mentioned the term, the political economy, around the fact that so many people seem to think children cannot learn. And that is sort of a long-standing conversation in the whole field of learning and education. And I think I'm glad that you raised it, Karen. I'd like to bounce it back, and I'm going to go in reverse order this time. I'm going to go John, Govinda, Sylvia, to get a little balance on this, and to see if you can respond to that question. And maybe, and I do have questions from the audience too, so keep them coming. And after maybe responding to this question, I'm going to go over to the Q&A box, which I have in front of me. So, John, response to Karen Mundy. You're on mute.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Karen, for that provocation. I think the biggest crisis I see where I come from is the contentment with the learning of a few. So when you look at that, like now the results of the national examinations, when they are released, the whole country is busy celebrating 10% of the learners. And no one questions really the bottom. So I think this has been sunk into our minds that it is okay if a few do well. And so this, I think, a way of thinking, you find it in parliament, you find it among parents, you find it in teachers. And the way resources are organized is indeed to support the learning of the few. So in terms of now shifting the mindsets in the political economy, that would lead even to reallocation of the resources, or asking the hard questions about the 60% failure, for instance, at the end of secondary education level, like we saw in Kenya last month. People are not ready for those conversations. The system is uncomfortable. And I think these are really where we have to push the points, because the elite are the ones who are making the policies, and because these policies favor them and their children and their networks, then they are never able to be accountable for the bottom. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Govinda.
Yeah, I fully agree with what John said, and Karen's point that we have a situation in which the whole policy making is skewed in favor of the rich. Not that you spend so much money on the rich, the rich can spend on their own. This is the problem, actually. The political economy, as she said, works in such a way that those who can spend, they can really rise, and those who cannot spend, we don't spend on them either. This is the government does. So that is the problem, actually. So you create a psychological feeling that after all, people are spending their own money and they're with their own capability, they are rising. So don't question, this is democracy. But we don't spend on the people who cannot raise on their own, and they remain where they are. That is the way political economy works. That is the case in India. And this is not new. This is something that we have been talking about since our pre-colonial period, that, it was a class-based system that we had, and we didn't really change. That's the same probably in Kenya and other places also, that the colonialists actually promoted a sectional approach to the segregated approach in that fashion. The class and the mass, that division has remained even in the post-colonial period. So in a different way, what is required is a decolonizing the education system in the new framework that we are talking about. That's where we have failed in decolonizing our education system.
Thank you very much, Govinda. And Sylvia, your thoughts?
Yes. Well, I want to say that I totally agree with what John and Govinda have said. I would add to that I think there are two problems in political economy. One is the fact that education changes take a long time because they are generational. And politicians and people who make decisions have short-term views because they want to see results. And I think this is a tension that has always been there in education. No? The short-term decisions that will see results on the short term, but things that we need are for the long term. So we need long-term policies that are usually not there, or they are interrupted by the changes of the administration. So that, I think, is something that we have to deal with, has to do with the change of mindsets. Another thing, agreeing with Govinda about the colonialism, one of the things that colonialism brought with it is the fact that the people that are in the elite position, like decision makers, are not seeing or listening to what is happening at the bottom of the pyramid. No, they really are, they're completely ignoring it. They don't know about it because they never see it. They never interact with these people. No, they have their own bubble. Our societies are very polarized. So I think this is another problem, because if they had this possibility of relating directly to reality, maybe their sensibility would be different. No, so that is something that I say. And then on the part of teachers, what Karen was saying, I think that there is this tendency to always put the blame outside themselves. No, the blame is on the parents that are illiterate and don't help their children, or the blame is in the system that doesn't support us and doesn't give us. And I think that this question of agency for the teachers is very important. They need to have this agency, this conviction that they can make a difference. And this is something that is not always there. Sometimes it's there and it makes a difference, but it's not always there. So I would say these three things, the first things that come to my mind are there. And another thing that I would say is that, yes, I think we are facing complex problems that need complex solutions. And that is why we have all of us, systemic outlooks on how to solve the problem. And I think this can be made further complex by thinking about intersectoral needs. No, actually, we should, when we think of the child, we have to think of the whole child that has health needs and nutritional needs and housing needs and emotional needs, and we have to think of the whole child, and that is something that really goes beyond what a school teacher can do and needs the support of other sectors of society. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. And I have more questions than we have time for, but I'm going to summarize. There's a comment in here from Jordan Naidu that's more a comment than a question. I'm going to turn it into a question, because he talks about a little while ago about, are we, the panelists today, talking about a utopian situation? I know Jordan well enough to know he's not, doesn't mean it in exactly the way I'm going to frame it. But I'm going to ask Govinda. I'm going to sort of select each of you now to respond to a question quickly, though, because
little time.
Just of time. But so the question I'm going to ask you, Govinda, from Jordan is your vision of India a utopian vision? Is it something that you'd love to see? You're a senior scholar. You've seen it all, top and bottom, left to right. Are you asking too much in your presentation today? Is there a way that, how would you respond to that question? Are you tinkering toward utopia, or are you being very practical, or somewhere in between?
I don't think it is utopian that I'm talking about. I'm only talking about what is just and fair, nothing beyond that. It is just and fair for everyone in a democracy. That's what I'm talking about. If that is utopian, that to be just and fair, as our constitution says, yes, maybe I'm asking for that. That is how I look at it. I don't think it is utopian. It's fairness and justice. And I think they are the basics of democracy.
Okay. Actually, on this panel, I know everybody really wants to agree with you, but I wanted to be more of a debate here. Okay, so I have a question some time ago from Dell, all in caps, the name, asking about what do we say to planners and to leave no one behind or marginalized. I'm going to turn this to you, John. You meet with planners, you know planners. What do you tell them when you're talking about diversity and inclusion? How do you convince the planners that they should put your issues higher on the priority list in terms of what they want to do in education? John?
Thanks, Dan. I hoped that would come to me, and it has. So the planners need to plan with the bottom. There is something very painful we do in our organization in terms of we have maintained one geography, a county called Turkana, which is that corner of Kenya, South Sudan, and Uganda, because we believe that it is so difficult to make any result there because of the conditions. And yet that's where the children that need attention are. And so we have maintained Turkana as one of the geographies of our work, even when we know we may not make a difference, as Sylvia says, maybe the difference will come in 20 years. But because whatever will work there, will work for the rest of the country. So I think if planners can adapt the plan more to the bottom, because whatever will work at the bottom will work for the top. And if I had time, I could have shared one of the philosophies. There's one Catholic priest called Father Romano who talks about the pedagogy of love, that when the pedagogy is focused on the heart and on children who don't learn in the classroom, rather than focusing on those that are learning, then even those that are at the top benefit from that kind of a pedagogy. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, John. Difficult to choose which question to ask Sylvia. There are many that relate to her. There's one specifically where Josephat Mukanji is asking a question about learning outcomes. And I know you care about learning outcomes, and the question's with respect to all three countries, but what would you say are both the pros and cons around learning outcomes in the data, both in that you saw in your chapter? What are let's put it in terms of obstacles. You have data collected. Mexico is a country that collects a lot of data. We heard that Govinda said, in some ways, we have too much data. We're drowning in data, but a lot of it isn't so relevant. So how would you respond to that question? Lots of data. How much of it is relevant? Should it be? How can we improve that relationship between the collection and its relevance to the issues that we're talking about today?
Yes, well, I think that Jonathan is referring mainly to tests, and to test information and whether that is an adequate measure of learning. And I think, well, of course, it has its absolute limitations. Testing has limitations, and one of the limitations is that it's also one-size-fits-all model. No, it's the same test for all the children that are very different and in different cultures and in different environments. So it does have a certain bias against those that are at the bottom. No, and those are, but at least we have some type of measure of learning. In my country, for a long, long time, we didn't have any idea of what learning was like. And the first study that was made was actually led by the IIEP in 1991, where we first tested students after about 50 years of no testing whatsoever. And there we discovered that what schools were achieving was completely different in one region than in another, and in the rural areas and in the urban areas, and that learning was actually alarmingly low. So I think that it's very important to have information about learning, even though we know that tests have their limitations. They are very partial. They have this bias because they are the same for all. But we do need information, very important information regarding learning. And I think that the secret is that information that we have from standardized tests is not to be used for judging individual schools, individual teachers, or individual children. It is made for feedbacking into the system and for decision making. And of course, we also need formative assessment at the school level, at the classroom level. No? And that is something that the teacher, the only one that can do it is a teacher, the teacher, him or herself. But I think that we need to have learning measures to be able to discover gaps and to be able to attend to them. And sometimes we don't. We just have the information there and we don't do anything with it, which is a problem. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now, actually, Karen, I know you're going to make some closing remarks, but I wonder if we as panelists could ask you a question, and that is, and maybe you're going to say to me that I'm going to answer all questions in my closing remarks. But I think one of the questions on people's minds is sort of how do you see this fitting into the kind of conversation we're having here, fitting into the near-term ideas that you're thinking of in terms of IIEP, or do you want to fold that over into your final comments on the panel? That's a question, Karen.
Well, maybe for sake of time, I'll fold it into my final comments, Dan. I think we're both going to say a few words at the end. So are we ready to move to that? And also, I'm very happy to respond to questions about IIEP, of course. That would be absolutely my pleasure.
We have about 10 minutes to go. And so I thought this specific question might be interesting. You may have other comments to make, broadly speaking, about the panel, but we can do it in whatever order you wish.
And I see Govinda's finger going up. That means he might also have a question to add to IIEP. So please put me on the hot seat. That's my job.
Govinda, you're muted. You're muted.
Now, I've been reading the chat box and then seeing so many people have commented and mentioned about teachers. I think, if you're talking about prioritizing where we need to really act when it comes to, I go around the country in the various schools. When I go to the village school and then look at the children who are struggling, who can help those children? I know there is only one person who can help, that is the teacher. We need to bring teacher back to the center stage in education process. We have played around in this world so much about recruiting teachers who are para teachers, contract teachers, substandard teachers, or community teachers, all kinds of things that we have done. And that has not really helped. IIEP has brought out a big volume on para teachers and contract teachers, in fact. We need to really bring teachers back to their real position. They are the people who can change the life of these poor children. Nobody else in a village can change. The parents themselves cannot do. It is only the teacher. And they all look up to the teacher. So I would say that, let's really bring this to the central place as an important issue about teacher and teacher professional development. And technology can be of great help. If at all technology has to be used, I think tremendous possibilities of using technology and digital platforms for improving the quality of the teachers. And I don't think the world has done enough in the developing countries as to how teachers and technology can be brought together. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay, well, maybe in that sense, I think maybe I should try to do a little summary and then you follow up, Karen. Would that be okay?
Absolutely. Perfect.
And I'm gonna start by actually responding to the last comment, which is in fact leads into that is in the chat box. Dawn Barrett says, data is data. It is how we analyze data and use that information to make interventions. And in the spirit of our debate, I'm going to disagree with Dawn Barrett, who I don't know, but because I think it depends on what data. And I think the overriding principle from my perspective is one of, and this is my own professional view, is that one of the reasons why the bottom of the pyramid has been ignored is that people have tended to gather data where they could gather data, which were convenient places with convenient metrics, with large scale funding. And people have done analyses. I have a book out on this topic, Learning is Development, where it's clear that somewhere around 90% of all the data we've collected is on a small minority of the population of the world. We don't have a lot of data on children at the bottom of the pyramid, nor on teachers at the bottom of the pyramid. And of course, as people have mentioned, technology, we don't have much technology on the bottom of the pyramid. So it's very difficult to make interventions in a space where we have so little information. But I think we can, this is sort of, and if I can turn it into a positive comment, that is, we do need data, but we need data that allows us to do the kind of strategic implementation that John was referring to, and referring to another colleague in his presentation. It isn't just any data that matters. It's if you care about the initial mission of the UN and the Sustainable Development Goals and UNESCO itself, it is about trying to achieve a more equitable world, and a world, in this case, in education and in learning. We can't do that unless we understand the differences between the different quintiles, if you will, within countries, not just between countries or between, in Govinda's sense, between Indian states. It isn't enough to know the differences between Rajasthan and Andhra Pradesh. That doesn't take you very far, I think, as Govinda was saying. And I think similarly, Sylvia was saying, I think in her presentation, among other things, that if you don't understand the indigenous population, among other things, if you don't understand the needs and desires and differences within the indigenous communities of Mexico, it's going to be, and this is not a new item, it's just hard to get it up high enough on the list. As Sylvia said in her remarks and in her paper, even the work that does pay attention to indigenous populations is largely ignored by the national government. The national governments tend to look at what's going on nationally, not what's going on specifically in contexts. So, and I think similar comment to John's paper, which is on issues around inclusion and disability. It's been a long time. People have known about disabilities for a long, long time, and it's only now with work of the kind that John is doing that brings it into the foreground. So I'd like to say that the first issue, at least as I take away from this debate, but also fits with my own view of things, is who are we talking about? It isn't by chance that we chose the term, which is imperfect. Nobody likes to be at the bottom of the pyramid or even be talked about that way. But it does help us understand that there's a group of people across very diverse cultures and societies, which for hundreds, not just decades, have been at the bottom of whatever metric we want to use. And it's been largely immutable, with the exception of what Sylvia was talking about. There are cases of positive deviance. And that's my second point. And that is, I think she's absolutely right that we need to understand what works, but not just broadly. We need to understand what works for this most marginalized population. And in the case, as Govinda said, too, it's hard to get policymakers to go out and look at the, and I'm sure it would be true in Kenya and Mexico, hard to get people who are used to being in government and being well received and so on to visit schools in the poorest places and to understand what's going on. It's a natural, very frequent observation that people have made. This can be changed, I think. And it's the kind of change in policy planning I hope that IIEP will continue to push forward. And finally, a comment that I think needs to be further explored. In the world that I look at, every time I open up a World Bank document or many of my friends who work in NGOs and so on. It's all about, and particularly in the ed tech area, it's all about scaling up. What silver bullet do we have that can, what's the app for Uber that would work for basic education in rural Kenya? You know, can we find that that app? Can we scale up? Well, scaling up, of course, sounds good to the ministries, because then they go to the finance minister, we can do this much over this many people with this much money. But we all have, all the panelists, I think, have observed that if you spend too little or you don't focus on the bottom, you'll end up mainly using your money where most of the people are, which is in some cases at the bottom, but most of the time it gets shifted. As our chapter on financing shows, the per capita inputs are much higher in the top of the pyramid than in the bottom of the pyramid. So we're left with some, I think, huge issues. There's a lot on the plate for the International Institute of Educational Planning to think about, and for Karen Mundy maybe to talk about and close out this panel. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the presenters from my side. It's been very enriching. Over to you, Karen.
All right. I have 3 minutes until closing. So I would just say, to me, this has been a very rich, a very exciting panel. And you know, Dan has kind of posed a question: what will IIEP do with this wonderful volume, these essays, and how will we use it? And I'll just say a little bit about the vision that I have for IIEP's work in what we now call management for learning, an area of work that where we draw together how do we better support both central level and middle level actors to take learning equity seriously. So this is a new sort of bringing together of different threads of IIEP work. Now, we know that when sector planning happens, the attention to learning is more focused today than it has ever been before. So that's changed, and that is continuing to change. And the emphasis on equity, bringing together learning equity with other kinds of equity inputs. School feeding programs, I think Sylvia mentioned, early childhood education, that's also improved. We see the connections when we're supporting national sector strategies. But where we see and the disconnect, and where we hear an increasing demand from governments that come to us, member states that come to us and ask for our support, is to support implementation challenges. Now, when you support implementation challenges, really what you're trying to do is strengthen the capacity of actors down the delivery chain to be stronger agents of change in their own right. So this requires a new way of thinking about management that isn't just administration and the school becomes a post office box where just receives circulars and then implements them, but that the school becomes a learning organization, that the districts become supporters of learning within the school and within their districts. They engage communities, they engage the learners, they use data effectively. But I think one challenge I think we have to face with data is that we produce more data without understanding what would make these end users use the data effectively to support learning. And that's really a tricky challenge right now. The more complex our data edifice, it seems to be in inverse proportion to the amount we really think about what level of data, what kind of data could be used at the classroom, school, and district level. So that's an area that IIEP will be pursuing. But in particular, this question of how do you manage effectively to ensure learning equity is, a bit of a different direction for IIEP. We've done pieces of this work. We have a great program in West Africa on improving quality management. We're actually engaging district and local leaders in debates about innovation. So what could they do at small scale to improve the quality of learning? But these areas, I think, are the areas, these are the forefront for IIEP. It isn't so much that the diagnostic is something we've always done, and we see a lot of improvement in the diagnostics. The implementation, the system transformation through improved implementation capacity, I think that's the sort of future horizon for IIEP's work. So I'll close there, but also again, thank you very much to panelists for a great start, a kickoff to our 2022 strategic debates. And I really do sincerely appreciate the contributions you've made to the book. And I hope we can call on you again during the year as we evolve this management for learning portfolio at IIEP.